So Liz, what's on your radar?
Well, how could it be that Americans simultaneously distrust their government, believing it's wasteful with their hard-earned dollars, but they also want to empower federal government bureaucrats to do more? Just 20% say they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing just about always or most of the time, reports Pew in recently released polling data, noting that this finding has actually held steady over time, changing very little since George W. Bush's second term in office. But only a measly 8% of survey respondents describe the federal government as responsive to the needs of ordinary Americans. And get this, just 6% say the phrase "careful with taxpayer money" describes the federal government extremely or very well. Another 21% say this describes the government somewhat well. That's less than a third of Americans total, offering even tepid approval of the government's money handling. But perhaps people feel this way because inflation has recently ticked up to 8.6%. Or perhaps because Biden keeps blaming this pocketbook pain on Putin instead of acknowledging that his stimulus largesse got us into this mess. Or perhaps they feel this way because a new Government Accountability Office report found that 20% of federal unemployment relief handed out due to the pandemic was wasted, ending up in the hands of fraudsters or people who were actually technically ineligible. People broadly say the government responds well to natural disasters. About 70% of respondents to Pew agreed with this statement. People also give the government generally high marks for keeping the country safe from terrorists. Some 68% of respondents feel this way, though it's really hard to say whether they're referencing TSA's loving pat-downs, which statistically speaking actually do a very poor job of protecting us from terrorist attacks, or whether they're referring to something else. The government gets bad marks, however, on both setting immigration policy and alleviating poverty, with 3/4 of respondents in each category expressing dismay at government competence in both areas. You might think that all of this scares people off from wanting their government to do more for them. But no, a staggering 59% of survey respondents from both parties say it is the government's job to protect people from themselves. But who does all this protecting? Who do we empower to intervene in our lives for our own good? To tell us what not to eat, drink, smoke, and snort, to tell us where to put our money when we earn it, and how much money accumulation is too much, and where we ought to build our houses, and how we ought to educate our children? Well, government officials, of course. But 65% of all respondents reported that all or most people who pursue elected office do so to serve their own personal interests. So why, again, would we trust them? It is these people, the self-serving ones who we call politicians, who have failed historically to deliver results and been so wasteful with taxpayer money. It's these people that the majority of Americans think will use their power to smartly protect people from themselves. What? Of course, lots of people on both sides of the aisle have inconsistent political beliefs that don't logically follow. Public opinion polling consistently shows us that Americans don't really know that much about the inner workings of government or the details of specific policies because they're too busy living their normal lives and pursuing work and play, which is exactly what they should be doing. Being able to exist somewhat apart from politics is a sign of a healthy republic. Hopefulness that the government can deliver and that politicians will rise to the occasion is not something to disparage. We shouldn't become weary and defeatist in response to government fecklessness. But we should perhaps be a little tougher on politicians. We should expect a little more prudence from them when they're spending our money. And we should, at absolute minimum, re-examine the basic premise that we want them to protect us from ourselves when they've repeatedly proven themselves incapable of almost all of the basic functions we elected them to perform. It really disturbs me when I look at this polling data that people are so inconsistent with the types of things that they expect government to do, but also giving the government such consistently low marks in some of the most important areas. I mean, setting immigration policy, poverty alleviation, administering public housing and welfare. These are things that we absolutely, I mean, I'm a libertarian, so I'm supposed to be all like burn it all down, but like to some degree, man, I walk past, we're both New Yorkers, I walk past public housing projects in my neighborhood, and I think it is good that people in my neighborhood have access to that type of housing, and I want it to be administered well. I don't want there to be lead paint and asbestos, right?
Exactly. I think that goes to our earlier point when we talked about trying a method, seeing that it's not working out well, and then doubling down on it instead of doing something different. You know, So I don't agree with the idea that the government is there to protect us from ourselves. I think that very American concept is why you have so much government overreach, why you have so much of this large criminal system. So much of what I see in the criminal system are things that are just regular life disputes that the government has no business getting involved in. So I do agree with you on that point. I think the government is there to serve the people. And I think that kind of reconciles this disagreement, you know what I mean, amongst the people and about what's happening, right? I think people expect their government to do for them, and so they keep trying to put their faith there, and in so many ways, we don't have any choices about the taxes, right? Trust me.
Well, speak for yourself.
Ciao.
We can all get creative. I think you're pointing to something interesting, though. I think the libertarian notion is a little bit more negative rights oriented, whereas you're talking about a more positive rights conception of like, I'm interested in what the government shouldn't do for me and the things that they cannot abridge or infringe on. Whereas you're talking a little bit more about what the government ought to proactively do, especially once they've collected our money and deposited it into their coffers. And I think it's tough because like one of the things that I really appreciate about the sort of like technocrat leftist types like the Matt Iglesiases of the world is that they actually are somewhat interested in measuring results, and they are somewhat interested in paying attention to when the government experiments with X policy. What are the outcomes? They A/B test things. They have a natural proclivity toward that, and for whatever reason, that's not shared by most people, especially most people on the left.
I think there's probably a divergence between what we want to see and how these things get measured. What are the metrics for them, and how I guess genuine or disingenuous we find it based on what like media spin can be. But I do agree as far as like poverty, immigration, all these different things, right? You do embolden this government that you want to help with these things. You are paying all this kinds of money, and the exact groups that most need help, most need resources, are not receiving that help, right? Like you said, we do have NYCHA housing, but you can see, NYCHA housing when you see it. You can see the quality of it versus everything else. So I don't disagree that America's emboldened a large federal government, just as I also think the same thing for state governments, right? I pay a lot of New York taxes, federal and state.
We pay for the privilege of living in the city.
I pay for the privilege of living in the city and lining NYPD's pockets, and I have a big issue with
MTA,
that.
Though, we pay for the subway. Well, one thing I actually think about a lot it's a very concerning sort of political sentiment tide shift is the degree to which we've really, in recent years, moved away from wanting things to be means tested. And in my ideal world, we would do a whole bunch less of handing out money. We wouldn't do COVID stimulus checks given to people. But one of the ways that we could even marginally improve on these things is making things means tested, because, a family of relatively high earning lawyers who live in like an expensive city in America probably don't need government bucks handed to them in the form of stimulus.
But how many of them are the ones that are really getting that, right? Like,
I mean, there's a huge component of America's upper middle class. I really think like one way we could actually like streamline this and be much more efficient with government dollars is if we return to the era almost like the 90s and the early aughts of wanting things to be means tested as opposed to being universal. We see this now with AOC wanting universal, college debt relief and stuff like that. And it's like, well, why are we doing that for my friend who is a lawyer at a white shoe law firm in New York or my friend who's a doctor who works out on Long Island now, when in reality, they're not really the types of people who need that debt forgiven because they make $300,000.
But maybe that's, so as a lawyer that works in this field, right, a black lawyer, and I know lots of black and people of color that are able to enter these fields because they were able to get student loan debts, right? They otherwise didn't have access to it. And yeah, they might be in this profession now, but they aren't originally in the same places of privilege that other people are in. They do need this debt relief. They do have families and people that they're supporting.
Are they making six figures now, or are they making?
No, I mean, I sure am not. I'm a black lawyer.
I think you're touching on something that's important, like something that I like about like the Marxists. Am I allowed to say that on air? Like I like the Marxists a little bit. No, something that I like about the Marxists is the degree to which they're paying attention to the class component. And so like one thing that I think you're tapping into is that like not all lawyers are created equal. Not all lawyers are making $300,000 a year at a white shoe law firm. There's lots of different paths that people may pursue. And perhaps even having like public service loan forgiveness is something that incentivizes people to pursue some of those paths. But I think the thing that we really need to be doing in our political rhetoric is saying, okay, like, are you actually able to afford repayment of this debt or not? And I think it's important to be pretty clear about that. And we could have some amount of federal government largesse handed out to people who legitimately come from situations of poverty. But like, I don't know, the people that I'm talking about are rich people
Right.
who will have their loans forgiven, when in reality their salaries could forgive their loans and they could just stop going out to fancy Michelin star dinner.
I feel that, and I get that, but I guess for me it's about not placing the focus there. There are a significant amount of people that could really benefit from having their loans forgiven. And when you think about even like the public interest repayment program, I don't have any student loans, just for the record. I just want to throw that out there so no one thinks I'm advocating for my own personal interests, right? But I look at, a lot of my colleagues and stuff, they are stuck working in public interest for 10 years. That's a long time to
because
be in
of the
a
strings attached to public service.
Exactly. In a not lucrative field and not able to move and not having this mobility. So yeah, they took out all these loans. They took out at least, I think the average law school debt is like $110,000. That's a lot of money. They got all these loans and then they're forced to work in like public interest for the longest, where they're making shillings. They pay us in shillings. Yes. And
that's why I don't work for them.
Hey, listen, you get it, right? So they're forced to do that because they don't have any option. So I do think there has to be.
Well, but they do have the option. Like, they consented to that arrangement and that they judge that to be a good deal, and they get to rejudge that at any time if they want to.
Maybe, but when we have to look at like the true voluntariness of a choice. Like, yes, they made a choice, they consented to it, but
let's get super philosophical.
But do they really, truly have these options, right? Like, listen, I get it. I'm not totally unsympathetic to the position that like, okay, this is a privilege, this is a benefit that you can take out these loans. I'm from a country where you can't get some loans. If you can't afford it, you can't go. So I do get that. But I think in a large way, when you look at, people are going to take the options they have. If you know what I mean. If I can go to college, but it means I'm going to take out this large sum of money and then work with the parameters that I'm given, okay, but if I could get these forgiven and maybe, put this money, I'm not just working to pay back all this debt, and I can put this money back into the economy, I can, incentivize it in this way.
But who forgives it? I forgive it with my taxpayer dollars when I busted ass to graduate college in 2 years instead of 4 with no debt taken on by working my way through it. Like,
But if do we want to go through a life of well, I had to do it and it's not fair.
And I'm not interested in like the pulling the ladder up after you type thing, but I am interested in like there's this basic component of like our federal government, like our debt and our deficit is absolutely enormous. Mm-hmm. We just keep attempting to spend money on things and we haven't accounted for it.
Yeah.
And at some point this catches up with us, and in fact we're seeing the stimulus checks that led to inflation as an example of this, a very salient example of this.
Those stimulus checks were barely shillings. I don't know if I'm going to blame them for inflation.
For everything.
Oh,
anyways,
no.
But that segues.
If anything, they owe me more money.
That segues perfectly, though. The average cost of gas is now over $5 a gallon. Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University, Fadel Kaboub, joins us next to weigh in.